What's up, guys? If you've been following this coaching journey series featuring our student Jess, then you will know that she has had two main leaks holding back her thought process and probably stopping her from becoming a winning player at 25 NL Rush and Cash. The first leak is that she's been making a few too many polarization errors, either bluffing with the middle of her range or value betting too thinly, especially in big pots, and there are some hands of that nature today. One magical thing that happens on that note is that Jess actually interrupts herself and fixes one of her leaks in real time. This is such good evidence of progress. Spoon feeding will not do in poker. The student really needs to be able to fix leaks off their own back, and Jess demonstrates that she can do that excellently in today's video. The second leak she's of course been struggling with has been the inability to fight for enough small pots to hand read in the nitty-gritty common situations, make big calls where necessary, bluff where necessary, and just basically win more than her fair share of small pots. So we also look at a few hands today that focus on that. I hope you enjoy it. If you do like the content, don't forget to smash the like button and let us know what you think down below. If you have any questions for me, I'm happy to answer them. And of course, if you want more Carrot Corner poker education, then do check out our paid content over on carrotcorner.com. Now let's get to the video. Alright, Jess, let's get into a bonanza of hands now that you've told me that that's the right spelling of bonanza. I am happy that we can review a ton of hands today. Look at your small pot play. What do you reckon?
Yes, sounds good.
As I was saying to you there before we started recording, I do think due to your self-admitted lack of solver study and PIO and stuff like that, you've not really developed a full feel yet for where the parameters are, theoretically, in some situations. And I think this ace-jack could be a great place to start, just to exemplify that.
Awesome.
We kick things off here with the ace-jack off in the big blind. We have an open from cutoff, and we call, and then we get a flop of 8-3 deuce. Now, I've done a special thing with PIO that you can't actually do in solver-based stuff like GTO Wizard. I take it you've worked with some of that stuff, like GTO Wizard or equivalent?
Yeah, I have GTO Wizard membership.
Okay, so that's fine. It's good for quick sort of like how far am I from GTO. Do remember to look at like the EV when you're in there and not just look at frequencies. Frequencies don't really matter. What does matter is avoiding big blunders, and it's good for that. One thing you can do if you have a program like a custom solver like PIO is you can actually lock the opponent to play in a certain way. So what I actually decided to do here when I ran a sim for this is I decided to lock the opponent to always bet the flop. And I know that's not what all of your opponents are doing, but by and large, the 1/3 pot size c-bet strategy in these pools is made up of a lot of people who are range betting. It's a pretty common way to go about it. So let me show you what this sim actually looks like before we go any further. Okay, so what I've done here is I've told the opponent to always bet. This won't capture the exact situation in pool because there will be some people who fancy themselves as GTO Mavericks and they're like trying to pick the right frequency and replicate some nonsensical details from a sim that they looked at recently. They have the nerd voice that we like to do here on this channel. You all know it. You know it, Jess, as well. And they will try and be more exact than this, but most people are simplifying to betting range when they make the 1/3 pot size bet that your opponent made on this flop. Now, when that happens, the sim shifts away quite heavily from what you'd be looking at normally, and the defense is a little bit ridiculous now. So as we can see here, we're only allowed to fold 21.2% of the time to this 1/3 pot size bet, and that number is quite mathematically interesting, because villain's break-even point, if they had nothing, like any two cards, like kind of nothing, would be 25% here for this bet size. But it's not actually enough for us to fold 75% of the time here and defend only 25% of the time, because what actually happens is that because villain's worst hands here actually have a ton of equity, that wouldn't even come close to making them indifferent between bet and check. So in this spot, because we're not in a bad texture for our range, it's not great, but it's not awful, and because villains shouldn't actually be betting all of the time in game theory, what we get is this weird result where we actually fold less than that break-even point, and we make it in order to try to make villain indifferent to bluffing, in order to stop villain from just massively generating EV with every single air combo. That's what the defense is. What's more useful though is to look at your hand and to turn on the EV view. So if I go strategy EV here, it's going to pop up with the EV view. And as you can see, folding this hand to a 1/3 pot range bet is actually costing 7 chips, right? It's 7 chips profitable to call ace-jack, depending on whether you have a club or not. Even with no club, it's 7 chips. This is a 5-10 structure, so 7 chips is 70% of a big blind. Just imagine that for a second, that you're in one of the most mundane and common spots known to man, and then you lose 70% of a big blind. So this is a spot that's so recurring that it comes up like many, many times a session. Imagine losing 0.7 of a big blind, 70% of a big blind every time that happened. So you can sort of imagine the long-term impact that would have.
Yeah, definitely.
How does that sit with you, that idea, when I express it that way?
It turns into quite a big leak, doesn't it? Over when we're looking at maybe, I don't have a ton of volume, but like 20, 25,000 hands a month. That turns into quite a huge leak to be dropping that much in such common spots, because that is a common spot.
And your graph, it really does reflect that sometimes you make large mistakes in big pots, but you make lots of little mistakes in small pots. Remember in day one, I looked at your graph and I said, I'm going to give you this diagnosis. It might be wrong, but I'm going to give you it provisionally. Then we'll see what happens. I'm now 100% behind my diagnosis. I now know that it was right. Yeah, so that's what's happening. So realistically, there are two things for you to fix from this point onwards. We want to plug this common leak by defending in this spot. It would be better to raise than it would be to fold, because at least by raising, you make a sort of weird hybrid-y mergy thing, but on the flop it's hard to make a polarization error like you can on the turn of the river. Hands are a bit closer together in equity, so you can raise here. And when you do, it's mostly a bluff. Villain probably folds some better hands like ace queen of hearts, ace king, with no backdoor, etc. And you get called by some worse hands and you're live and you have a little bit of implied odds when you hit your outs and stuff like that. So raising is a big improvement on folding. Calling is probably the number one play in GTO here. And GTO Wizard may not agree because it doesn't know that your opponent's betting more often than GTO. I would say if this is a GTO c-bet range, it's quite break-even this hand. Probably still a call, but break-even. But against a range bet, it really does swing in a massive way. This is actually the first episode of Cash Injection, the course on carrotcorner.com, that is all about how you can take pool tendencies and craft extremely effective strategies to obliterate the player pool and punish them for mistakes, imbalances, shall we say, such as this range bet here. So check out carrotcorner.com, guys. Right, Jess, so this is the first thing I wanted to say. That's really all I want to say on that hand, unless you have any questions.
No, the only one, like, when you're talking about raising here, is it better for us to raise with a club, like either the ace clubs or the jack of clubs, as kind of blockers and also a bit of more opportunities to kind of barrel turns? Or is it's this spot kind of just as good as that?
Well, I wouldn't compare those two things. I don't think that's a good comparison. I think that's apples and oranges. I think what you should always do is compare raising to calling to folding with this hand, and then do the same thing for ace-jack with a club. If you have ace-jack with a club, the EV of all of your continue options will be higher, regardless. So call will be higher than it would be with this hand. Raise will be higher. The question is, does raise become better than call with ace-jack with a club? And the answer is no, it's still a mix.
Okay.
This hand is probably better to call slightly, but there's not a big swing at all. If you look at this in GTO Wizard, you'll probably see that the hand pure calls, but it's not a big swing at whatsoever. With a club, it's probably a higher EV play, whatever you do, which means folding is more out of the question than it already was, but it will do both. It will sometimes call, sometimes raise. But the main point here for everybody watching is, don't compare a hand to a hand you don't have. Compare your options with the hand that you do have. That is a mantra. That is an absolute slogan that you should get tattooed on your arm. Jess, I know you already have tattoos on your arm. Is there room for one more?
Oh, there's plenty of room.
Excellent. So we can do that. Maybe you should demo the tattoos now that I've actually brought it up for the audience. What do you reckon? Yeah, plenty of room on the other arm then, for sure.
Yeah, definitely.
So next week, we expect you to be brandishing a tattoo that says, compare the EV of two lines with the hand that you have. Don't compare a hand to a hand that you don't have. Very eloquent thing to have tattooed on your arm, right? I need to get a life, perhaps, instead. And a guy that's like 75 at a bridge tournament that we were in a team with them this weekend, my girlfriend and I, and we'd have dinner with him and stuff after the bridge. And at one point he said to me, he just turned to me and said, perhaps you need to get a life. And I was like, okay, a 75-year-old man at a bridge tournament has just told me that, so it's probably true. Moving on. Tens, call. We go for a large c-bet here. I think that's totally fine. GTO will probably bet half pot or something here. It'll be like the solver nerd sizing, but we don't care about that because it's not an EV swing. And we get a call from the big blind. We decide to barrel the turn, which I think is a pure play. I think against people's true ranges here, you just always want to bet the spot. Bam.
Oh, God, this was yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so this, I do actually remember this hand. I think the fold here is because of his kind of range in the small blind. It was a single raise pot, and I don't think he's got a full stack at the start, has he? So kind of like, I just think he's going to call with lots of trash that kind of connects with this flop in like two pair ways, maybe. But then the 4 on the river, kind of any ace, any 6, plus all the 2 pairs that were already there. And then when he donks out, it just seems like somebody trying not to miss value. It seemed like quite a strong line.
A few things are good here, a few things are bad here. One, two pair is not really what you'd expect to be the value region here, and I know they can be a bit merged, but to shove two pair on this river would be, what would that be?
Polarization?
It would be, yeah. So we're indoctrinating you into Carrot Poker School terminology here, getting you to say all the slogans, and if you're not going to get them tattooed on your arm, you could at least say them, and you've done a good job of that. This is not going to be two pair. This is not going to be a set in GTO. It's going to be like, obviously we're not in GTO, but it's going to be a6 and 6-6 or a bluff. Now, I would be more to the point here. The reason you are folding here, and I agree it is 100% a fold, but the reason you are folding here has nothing to do with the range composition pre-flop or the fact that he has these little cards. This is too vague. This is like the eyes doing the thinking instead of the brain. That thought process. Yep. It's like you're looking at a deuce, a 3, a 4, and a 5, and the eyes are thinking rather than the brain. So when the brain switches on here, we see that 6-6 and a6 are also really abundant, but the biggest point is that this is a massively underbluff node. There's just like, it's so rare to be bluffed here. Like, okay, they can have like exactly the king queen of clubs and sometimes freak out, but you're talking about like winning, I don't know, 8% of the time when you call here, and you need 31% equity. So the biggest reason this is a fold is just that there's a value region and a bluffing region, and the value region way outweighs the bluffing region based on what villain will actually choose to do this with when they reach this river. So your hand reading here, it's a little bit too far in the past. It's not that preflop is irrelevant, but it should more be the line villain has just taken and what you think about that defines how strong you think the range is. It should be the range that lands on the river, that's called the flop, and the turn out of position that determines that. It shouldn't really be the preflop range. That's a little bit far removed, temporally speaking. Anything to add?
No, and I have been thinking about it times in the past where I've kind of looked at the ace on the board and just decided they've got an ace and focused on that. I've been really thinking about that in hands and calling where I'm like, well, he doesn't always have an ace. Instead focusing on it, especially with hands like kings and queens and stuff like that, where I just maybe in the past have decided to give up almost as soon as the hand starts. As soon as we see a flop, I thought, brilliant, I've lost. I'm kind of sticking around and trying to call a bit more in lesson 4, literally what I'm watching about polarization, like calling kind of defensively almost, like when we still have some value instead of just folding all the time when we see big hands cards like that.
Yeah, it's about understanding how bad the ace is relative to the situation. Like in this spot, the fact that the ace is a straight and the 6 is a straight is horrific because villain is filtered away from other stuff, away from air, towards stuff that's either 2-pair showdown value, set showdown value, or a straight, mostly. So we just don't win here. Like we hardly ever win here. But if you're calling a c-bet on 8-4-4 and the turn is an ace, big blind against small blind, and you have an 8, you call again because relatively speaking to the norms of that spot, your hand is still like really good. And if you fold that, you're folding almost everything. So being able to actually say, well, how good or bad is the ace in this exact situation? Like how does it react to or relate to the ranges that reach this node? And that is a function of pre-flop, as you say here. It's also a function, and more so, a function of what happened more recently than that. Which is why I say on this river, get to the point about what villain's range is right here, right now. Let's stop thinking about pre-flop. Let's just say call, don call in on 4 straight. If I just say those 3 things, that should be raising red flags of underbluffed in your head when I say all of that together. Okay, great.
Yep.
So we flop a set here, and the turn is a jack. How would you think about this?
So here, I think on this, I would probably bet big here to try and get a bit of value, maybe an overbet to try and get some sort of value because we've checked the flop. But I would also be thinking I'm probably not going to make much more from this hand because jacks would have probably c-bet.
Okay, so in theory, you make loads from this hand because 1, villain has to call the turn bet with far more than just a jack. They have to call pocket pairs 6-6, ace high, straight draws, you name it. Tons and tons of stuff villain has to call here. Also, if they did only continue a jack but never check a jack back, they'd be playing an absurdly capped strategy, and like maybe the pool is a bit closer to that than theory is, but you can't go all the way of just saying that the jack bets the flop and they don't call anything else. So this is the exact thing I'm talking about, where maybe your theory is a little bit lacking. And what you could do a bit more of here is calibrate to the late position configuration, button, big blind, and the lack of flop filtering. The lack of flop filtering is very key here. So when it does go check on the flop, what does that do to ranges? What does it do to both ranges, that action sequence on the flop?
Keeps them super wide.
Yeah, wide, condensed, capped in his case, uncapped in your case, but very, very, very wide. What that means is that if villain has ace queen here, it's still a very good hand as far as the average strength of both ranges goes. which means that if you lead out here, ace queen has to call. It's not even optional.
Yeah.
If you lead out for b75 or something like that. Do you have to bet, theoretically speaking? Is it mandatory or is it optional?
I would maybe say optional. Yeah, it makes me want to say mandatory, but I don't think it is. I think it's optional because it kind of keeps their bluffs in. It lets them do silly things on turns and rivers.
Mm-hmm. That's the key. Turns and rivers. Love it.
Yeah.
Now, if you were in position, there's no turns. You check, you go to the river. This is where positional urgency comes into play. Remember that?
Yes.
How does that go?
In position? Oh, God. No, maybe I don't. I'm trying to remember this now.
Yeah, so I'll give you a few prompts here. So the idea is that when we're in position and we're facing a check, if we check back, we don't have that street to pot build anymore. So if villain checks the turn and we check back here in position, I know that's not the case in this hand, we can't pot build. We go to the river, the pot remains small. That's a bit of a problem. We can't check raise. A more snappy tattoo would actually be, if you can check raise, you don't have to value bet. That's a little bit better. Not saying it's something you should get, but it is a bit better than the first one. So that's why positional urgency is all about whether you have the chance to pot build the street and to what extent if you check. It's actually weird because if you check here and face a bet, the urgency is actually higher out of position, because now if you merely call and check the river procedurally, which you will, villain can check back and end the hand and no more money goes in at all. So urgency switches positionally and sequentially depending on the position in the action sequence. So when you're out of position, urgency is always higher when you face a bet and lower when you're checking to the opponent. And when you're in position, urgency is always higher after you face a check, because if you check back, you'll go to the next street. So it's kind of an inverted thing. So that's interesting. So you don't actually have to bet here, in theory. In practice, I also don't think you have to bet here. If you think villain's range is super weak and you don't think you're going to make any money because you think they have a super underprotected flop checking range, it might even be better to check raise. At least that way, if they do have a jack or a pocket pair or something decent or a six, and they decide to bet, you can get check raise in. And also you can let them bluff. If you just think they have a ton of queen 8 here and stuff like that, then you can let them bluff those hands. So check is definitely fine here. I think if you are betting, big bet or overbet makes a lot of sense, but I think you can also check here. It's not totally clear to me what's better. This is a bit small. When you're leading this turn, you really want to lead hands that are like Jack X plus for the most part, maybe some pocket pairs, but all of those hands can bet bigger. You don't have to use like a small sizing here, and I would be greedy here. I wouldn't be worried about, trying to get villain to continue or being worried that they fold or anything like that, because you'll make way more money long term in poker if you maximize magnitude of what you do win rather than frequency. Because in GTO, this needs to get raised a lot in order to have the same EV as a bigger bet. Promise you that. If you compare that in a solver, you'll see that. How often does this get raised in real life?
Not very.
Yeah, and that's the issue.
Yeah.
So let's size up here. Or check raise. Let's get more money into the pot here.
Okay.
Alright. Ace King. Open. Call by big blind. Check. 1/3. Call. Check. So we go for a turn bet here. Let's hear a thought process for this spot, and you don't have to stand by your play if you don't want to. You're allowed to say, like, I don't like my play now, or you can stand by it. What do you think?
I think probably maybe do stand by it. I think they can call they can call with lots on the flop. They're going to have like lots of queen, jack, jack 10, ace, queen, like maybe one diamond hands as well that are like jack calling with backdoor diamonds. The 9, obviously pair in the board makes it less likely they have some sort of sets or like 8-9 or something like that. Kind of as I'm speaking it out now, I'm thinking, but we are winning here sometimes. So all we're trying to do is make worse hands fold here. I don't know, because we do win this hand sometimes. We do win this hand plenty of times actually with ace king. So we're kind of turning it into a bluff when we do have some value here, I think. So maybe I've changed my mind halfway through that process.
I love it. I love it. I think what we heard there was your old game slowly being dragged into the present by your new game. I always imagine it. I watched this video once that was about the human brain and how the stuff that's like physically in the middle of the skull is like neither here nor there. It's like kind of cognitive, but not really. And then the stuff at the back is like proper lizard brain, like primal, bash to death with club and take meat and eat kind of stuff. And then at the front, we have like more of our like emotional, advanced emotions, like empathy and all of that, and compassion and like cognitive thought and like being able to actually do interesting stuff. So what that reminded me of was like your mind sitting in the middle, and it can either get pulled back into like your old barbarian thought process, or it can get pulled forward into your more like scholarly thought process that you have now. And you did a really good job of saying, well, wait a minute, I'm listing all of these hands I think villain can have that aren't that good, but I beat all of them. And what am I doing? Like, there's no primary reason for this bet. It's not a value bet. It's not a bluff. It's literally smack bang in the middle. It couldn't be more of a polarization error. It couldn't be. Unless you didn't have the ace of diamonds, then it would be even worse. But yeah, this is not a good bet. And your old thought process is fully responsible for this. Let me put it to you a better way. You take the worst line when you bet. There are two lines, check and bet. And bet is lower EV than check.
Yep.
Yeah, because bet, when you bluff, you reduce the EV to nearly zero. Not quite, because you do have two stellar overcards. You do block the raising range with ace of diamonds, which is lovely. But yeah, you bring the EV down towards zero. Whereas when you check, you have maybe like 35, 40% of the pot still.
Yeah. And by betting, if we get called, then our EV just drops because they call with hands which beat us.
That's the branch you have to consider. If you ignore that branch, then of course you want to bet everything. If you ignore the branch where the bet costs you extra money, then every bet becomes a free roll, and the slightest reason or the slightest glimmer of fold equity is enough reason to bet. If you had 100% equity here, the GTO would actually be that you bet and they fold. That would be the end of the hand. Or maybe you check and they never invest on the river. That would be the GTO because they'd know your range and vice versa. So in this spot, it's not that you have anywhere near that much. And because most of the better hands in villain's range continue, you can't bluff. And because not many of the worst hands continue, you can't value bet. And you don't have enough starting equity to value bet. So yeah, you have to check back here for sure. I'd love to see these bets stop permanently. We get raised. I think I would probably just fold now. I mean, yeah, I would definitely just fold now. I mean, your outs are terrible. This is an underbluff node on the 9 for sure. There's a bunch of this in Grade E that's coming out in the summer, guys. It's an exploitative mass data-driven course. It'll be out from July, and that course talks in great detail about which lines are really underbluffed. This is one of them. Paired turn, not an appetizing spot for you to bet a lot in. Also, well, it is really, but people don't see it that way, and not an appetizing spot to raise. Like if you get bet into on this turn, raising is just very counterintuitive, I think, for most people. So I'd say this is pretty underbluffed and not a continue I'd want to make. So it's a good fold. But yeah, I'd just love to see these go away. Your small pot play, it's so sloppy, and I don't mean this in a bad way, it's just costing you so much money. And you're kind of surviving, even though you're playing small pots this way. And that's because you're aggressive. And it shows you what aggression can do. But blind aggression is also costly. So it's like, yes, I've got this really powerful aggressive faculty that a lot of players don't have. A lot of players are permanently petrified, actually. And you're not. You have this faculty to just attack. But untempered, it spews back 75% of the gain. That's why you're surviving but not thriving.
Yeah, definitely.
So let's temper this. Splash pot, I don't actually... Do I care? Do I care about splash pots? Yeah, I love the bet. I think you can barrel here. Or not. This sort of river you might consider bet check, bet bluff here, I think. I know splash pots get a bit wild, but it's probably not a bad spot fold equity wise in mass data.
Yeah, I feel like, I don't know. I wasn't sure on the river at all about whether we can try and push him off of a weaker hand, especially because it was a splash pot and people just get far too attached to random stuff. Like right. you could see someone calling here with like 3-6 or something because it's not a huge pot. They don't have to think, oh my God, I'm losing a stack calling with my bottom pair. They just call it off.
I think this is a spot that, to be a bit more specific about it, in a non-splash pot environment, this is probably overfolded according to data. And the reason is that this is a scare card river where they make a lot of really good hands, but they're meant to slow play a lot of them, in theory. So when they don't find the slow plays here with straights and two pair and stuff, which I'm sure you'd agree they usually don't, they can end up overfolding very easily here because they have too many hands, exactly like, 4-6 or whatever it may be. Now, the issue is that the splash pot does flick a kind of insanity switch in most humans' brains, and we are against humans here, and we do have to figure out that when that's been flicked at the start of the hand, it's much more likely that we don't reap the normal amount of fold equity. So I do like the give up here, but I wanted to point out that these kind of rivers, the bet check, bet bluff line is extremely effective in these spots in general, when the river is like scary like this, and they've obviously taken a very capped line. If the board was like 9-4-4-3 deuce, it's less effective. You do get snapped by random curious hands a lot more. So this one is definitely probably a fold, but I think raise is okay as well. I don't know about call here. Raise with these backdoors is probably just about fine. It's the kind of play that breaks even in theory. In practice, though, I have a problem with raising here. What do you think that problem is?
The under the gun open.
That's part of it.
Yeah, there's slightly bigger range, slightly bigger bet size, and it's not your standard like third c-bet.
Right. This is the thing. So when people range bet here, they're actually betting more than the solver. They're betting a weaker range than the solver. When they bet big, they're betting a stronger one. Because if you want to play GTO here, and you're not very good at GTO, which is like 95% of the 25NL GTO nerds are horrible at GTO, they're not actually playing anything like it, and they'll get to this spot and they'll be like, I have better bluffs than the King 6, I check. But really, the King 6 is like a very high frequency bet in GTO here, because you don't need any standards. That's why I say, like, don't compare a hand to another hand that you don't have, or you'll end up playing like a brain-dead GTO nerd wannabe that's actually just a predictable robot. You don't want to be playing it like a robot, but not playing GTO. That's awful. So their range here, because they fall into that trap, is actually going to be like way more flush draw, top pair, over pair, made hand, and high equity draw heavy, which makes raising not just bad, a catastrophe. Raising this hand against the sizing in this pool is a catastrophe. And every time the solver rolls a raise here, it blunders. That's why I don't think a solver would necessarily even win post-rake in this game. Come at me, chat. I know you're mad right now. I'm sorry you based the last 2 years of your life trying to be a solver. It's not that good. Jess, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think I agree with that.
You didn't raise, so...
I think that's just why I didn't raise. Just feels a bit too much for strong bet with their opening and sizing.
Okay. This bet is obscenely good for villain to make in practice. This is a cheat code. This bet here, I have a friend called James who does database reviews for people, and he sees that in almost every case, every single case where he does a database review, the student is grossly, egregiously overfolding to turn probes. Now, this is not a spot where you have a big range disadvantage. Okay, it's not a great spot for your range, but you don't have a big disadvantage here, which means you have to get close to meeting the so-called MDF for the spot, because you're not at a big disadvantage. The spots you overfold relative to that number are the spots that are awful for your range. This one, therefore, we probably have to call this hand to this sizing, because we're looking at a defense frequency of like, 70, 80% of the time. And you do, which is good. I like the call. I also think in practice, people are doing this really randomly. Like some people are doing this with any two cards, for example. They're just trying to pick up on a pool leak, and the people who do that will perform very well here. Their red line will be very flat. Your red line is not flat, because you don't win enough of these small pots. So that's just, again, food for thought. Honestly, I don't hate a call. That might surprise you.
I can't see me calling. I get why, why you wouldn't hate it.
So why wouldn't I hate it, and why wouldn't you do it? Let's talk about both of those things.
I wouldn't do it because of the bigger sizing, slightly filters them more, and it's more of a polarization.
Hold on though, objection. Does it not also limit the number of value combos they can bet? Is it not true that the bigger the sizing they use, the less hands that qualify for value for that sizing? So if they block bet, they could have a jack. Do you think they're doing this with a jack?
No, they don't bet this size with a jack because they have showdown value. It's good for them to see a showdown and maybe let me keep my bluffs in and bet the river with hands they beat.
Yeah, or use a smaller bet that actually doesn't turn their hand into a polarization mistake, as you say.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And the other thing is that you're telling me then that your value region is a set plus or two pair plus. You don't have over pairs. So you're telling me that you decided to bet a set or a straight this sizing on the turn. I smell a rat, Jess. I smell a rat here. I don't believe it. Maybe.
Yeah, I can see them betting bigger on the 10 for the same reason that I bet big with the 5s. Like, we've missed a bit of value by me not c-betting.
Yeah, I think it's very common for them to just like either check raise or a pot or something like that when they have a set or straight here. So I'm really... This line, I hate this expression, and I would never ever encourage you to say it, Jess, but it doesn't make sense. And I say this with like a lot of guilt and a lot of trepidation, because that thought process is one of the biggest excuses people use to call in spots where it doesn't make sense to them. The situation literally doesn't make sense to them, and they call because it doesn't make sense. That just means they're lost. That doesn't mean there's anything like weird about Villain's line. Here, however, Villain's line doesn't make any sense because many of the bigger hands are going to leave the range at this point. Yet on the river, they're saying, but I have a big hand. But it wasn't big enough to overbet, so like, is it even like a 4? It could be a 4. Sure, a villain could have a 4 here. I think this is super overbluffed. My only fear is that these donkeys have like ace queen, and you lose to ace queen because they're completely like have no idea what they're doing. But okay, fine, we can just take the rough with the smooth as far as that's concerned, and just say that this is way overbluffed. I think you win here like 75% of the time, actually. How shocking is that?
Yeah, it is a little. I think with the big sizing and stuff, it felt like I wouldn't have won that much. But it makes sense when you explain it that 100%.
You have to read the board and their range as well, right? You can't just default to big sizes or underbluff. That's not true. There's loads of big sizes that are overbluffed. Big flop sizes are too strong in pool. But that's because there's not been any pre-filtering. But here, villain is filtered so far away from hands that can actually do this for value, and so far towards just air, there's been such minimal filtering because you check behind on the flop, that actually they just have nothing the vast majority of the time here.
Right.
This is a spot to be a hero. This is a spot where you call with ace 10 and you feel like a hero, but it's actually no different to calling with like king jack. It's the same thing. Okay, the blockers are slightly different, GTO nerds in the chat already, the fingers are on the keyboards, like bits of fucking cheese on their fingers from what they were just eating, falling down the cracks in the keyboard. Guys, just stop typing. It doesn't matter. What matters here is that villain is constructing in a completely unbalanced way against which we win really frequently. So just call. It doesn't matter whether you have kings, king, jack, eights, ace 5 or ace 10. They're all the same hand for the most part. So yeah, this is about the hand read. You've got to start hand reading, Jess. You're being too vague. You're saying way too many things like, this is a big bet, therefore X. You need to engage a bit more with how villain got here. And I think one thing I'd really love you to work on this week is, one, just maybe defending a bit more in these small pots where people are overbluffing, where ranges are wide, where people are c-betting flop too much. But also, just really chronologically tracing a hand and being able to talk about how their range changes street by street. So saying something like, when I check back the flop, villain's range remains completely wide and unfiltered and air heavy and merged.
Yeah.
On the turn when they bet here, there's not necessarily much filtering at all. I would say that it's a bit more capped, that many of the big hands leave the range. Other than that, I don't think there's much filtering in pool's range. But now suddenly they're saying, I have a polarized range and their value region is tiny, and they got here with loads of air, ergo they're over bluffing. It's actually really crystal clear when you break it down in a chronological hand reading way. It's easy.
Yeah, definitely. That makes sense.
All right. Let's sum up how you feel about poker right now. Talk to me for a couple of minutes about what's going on with your game, what you're going to work on. Where are we?
I do feel like I'm starting to do that a bit more, like being a bit more analytical about people's ranges and filtering and how, like, where I might be at, and calling down a bit lighter than I have been in the past. And I have been picking up pots when I've been doing that. So kind of it does then reinforce it and be like, all right, cool. You are getting it a little. I have been running pretty bad in March, and I'm still trying to fix some mental game issues that I'm having with that. But that's also kind of improving, I think. I do feel like I'm still improving. I feel like sometimes the past week or so, I felt a bit overwhelmed with everything I'm trying to learn at once. So that's why I've gone back over that episode 4 after that hand yesterday with the Ace King on the, the rubbishy run out. I've kind of just decided, I'm going to go back over that because that's obviously not in my head enough yet for me to just be automatically doing it. So yeah, just like learning tons, a bit kind of making sure I'm not letting things fall through the gaps and when I'm trying to learn too much at once, because it's like it's not just my theory and stuff I'm trying to change, it's also mental game things, which are just as hard to change,
maybe harder. And it's also application. So there's really 3 domains here. There's mental game, there's theory, there's application. Theory is something you want to work through over a process of years. Like if I give you grade 1 of the Carrot Poker School and I say, right, go off and do that, the last thing I want is for you to like have done it in a week. That would be terrible. Now you need to just do it all over again. You probably retain nothing. So I think it's a case of like 1 episode every few weeks and just going over it multiple times, but spending loads of time pulling up your hand histories. Don't be, if you can help it, so much of a feather in the wind of short-term variance and turmoil. I know that you struggle with this. I know that you want to look to the graph. I know that you want to look to the bankroll challenge and all of this for validation and verification and just like giving you a sense of how well you're doing, but resist it. Really take accountability for how you play and review loads of your own hands in a very objective, analytical way, as if they're other people's hands. There's a bit too much of this, like, was this okay or not? Can I live with this? I want a hand review to be more of like, let's just take this objective exercise and see what you did there, and then like, what will we do better next time? I think we are improving, but the two main things I need fixed are the polarization errors that are still popping up way too frequently, but you did catch your own one there, which was lovely to see you find that in real time. That was actually real progress. I totally agree. And then secondly, just hand reading a bit more consistently, looking at texture, also looking at the action sequence, and really trying to wrap our head around what our opponent's range is, because at the end of the day, that's where the money comes from, is knowing what is their range and how do I exploit that? What do I do about that? That's the key.
Yeah, definitely. I agree.
All right, guys, we'll see you back here for the next episode of From Stalling to Mauling. Good luck this week, Jess. Hopefully March will turn around for you very soon. By the time you guys watch this, it may be April, and we'll already have the month graph, but we're not going to be moon hippies. We're not going to look at that. We're going to be long-term focused here, but also very short-term focused. Long-term in the sense that maybe we look at a graph every few months. Short-term in the sense that we look at hands. Lots of common nitty-gritty hands. That's what we need to do.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. See you next time. Bye for now, guys.